There are quite a few famously good subjects to get in EU4. Riga, for example, has excessively strong local bonuses on their province, making them an overpowered march to grab. Portugal, when vassalized or personal union, can colonize practically all of the Americas for you, and nations such as Syria, Byzantium, or for example Gascony have a large amount of high development cause for reconquest, as well as extra historical ways to take religious ideas. Byzantium, to be clear, understand why they have an extra way to go religious, but Syria or Gascony? Anyway, from the topic of good subjects, Georgia does rarely, I concede, also make the list. This fort-holding March Georgia is indeed the subject of today's video, as while most countries can obtain a normal Georgia for this purpose, it is hordes and their ability to gain an anarchist state Georgia that I believe lends itself to the funniest and most practically useful timeline, since hordes also disproportionately benefit from fort-holding vassals. Right, before we do begin, just a quick pit stop to say that a like would be appreciated if you haven't already, and a subscription would be amazing. With that all said, what do I actually mean by fort-holding vassal? If you already know what this is, feel free to skip forward to this time in the video, or to the next chapter. But if you don't know what a fort-holding vassal is, or want a quick refresher, or maybe you just really love watching every single second of Lemon Cake content available, in which case thank you, but anyway, yes, explanation time. When a province is occupied, in this case Paris here, we actually inherit all the properties of the province as the occupier. What this means is this 0.14 of tax, this 0.15 of production, aka 0.3 total income, actually goes to us. This also applies to the trade power. This 10.9 trade power is now owned by us and contributes to the 51 trade power we have within this area of the Champagne trade node. This is naturally quite strong, but let's also remember that the act of occupation itself reduces the income, trade power, and everything else from the province. As you can see here, the taxation we're getting from Paris is reduced by minus 50% due to occupation, and the trade power is reduced by 50% from the occupation, as well as the current French attempt to re-siege the province, giving a further minus 25% trade power due to the under siege effect. Now, to be clear, because you inherit properties from occupying provinces, it does mean that occupying things like gold mines is a good idea. This 3 development gold mine is already given us 0.9 production. But as you can tell, this minus 50% goods produced from occupation is not exactly making it the most productive gold mine in the world. However, the income from the province is not the only thing that gets transferred over to the occupier. If we consider this province of Charters here, indeed we are making 0.2 ducats from it, but this province contains a fort, and this fort has a maintenance of 1 ducat. When we consider our economy and fort maintenance here, we can indeed see that we are spending 8 ducats a month on fort maintenance, and the fort of Charters is indeed one of the forts that we are paying for. Another thing to consider is that the defensiveness of the fort is actually dependent on your defensiveness, not the defensiveness of the nation that you took it from. So the defensiveness of Charters is 2% because we have 2% fort defense from power projection. Now this matters because if this fort ever falls under siege again, for example, by the French troops on Paris, or if Charters has rebels spawn on top of it, well, you'd want high defensiveness so the fort holds out for a while. What's interesting, of course, is because the occupier of the province transfers their national modifiers to the siege, what we can do, for example, is grab a subject. In this case, I've grabbed Scotland here, who, for the sake of demonstration, I've given defensive ideas, because defensive ideas have some fort defensiveness, meaning that, as you can see, this fort at the moment has 2% fort defense. However, if we grant charters to Scotland, we can now see it has 35% fort defensiveness, because the Scottish monarchy has 10% in their government reform, and defensive mentality has 25%. This has also happened on exactly the same day. As you can see, we can switch this back on this exact same day tick with no progress, and just being told that they're now Scottish makes these soldiers significantly more defensible. Another key aspect to consider is that Scotland is now responsible for the maintenance of this fort. Now, of course, Scotland is now also making money from this province. However, usually, especially because of the occupation modifiers, occupations don't tend to pay for fort maintenance. But nevertheless, this means that we now don't need to pay for the fort maintenance. This burden now falls upon Scotland, and our fort maintenance is reduced down to 7 ducats. Just so we're all on the same page here, if we occupy Charters, 8 ducats fort maintenance. If Scotland occupies Charters, 7 ducats fort maintenance. Meaning that microing your fort occupations, aka passing them to a subject so you don't incur a financial loss, is actually a great way of saving money in the early game, when every single ducat really counts. And don't worry about the occupations for the peace deal. If they're your vassal, you can always grab them back at any point you want for when you want to go and peace out. And while indeed this is a really strong thing to do, make sure to remember that at the end of the day, this money isn't just free, someone is still paying for it. And if you're a very small subject that's going to struggle financially to pay for all these forts, well, eventually they will go bankrupt. So keep an eye on your fort-holding subject, and at times make sure to pay off their debt to prevent them going into bankruptcy. But indeed, this is the main point of having a fort-holding vassal. It is basically a vassal that you just give occupations to. And of course, don't forget, if you keep your vassals small enough, aka 25% or less of your development, you're also able to make them a march. This naturally makes them significantly harder to annex, but don't worry, you're not planning on annexing them, but gives them both minus 20% fort maintenance and plus 20% fort defense, as well as a selection of other military bonuses. So if you ever are having a vassal holding subject, it is strongly suggested to have them as a march. So how does Anarchist Georgia, with optional Coptic characteristics, get into the picture? Well, I do believe grabbing Georgia as a march for fort holding is a pretty known strat, but I want to build upon it today. So let's get into the game and do just that. And indeed, as alluded to earlier, we're going to need to be a horde for this. Now, I guess need is a strong word. We don't technically need to be a horde, however, it is significantly easier to set this up as a horde, and I'm going to use Great Horde here as an example, but again, any horde works. Anyway, stupid pedanticism aside, what we need to basically be is have the Steppe Nomad Tier 1 Tribal Administration selected, and as this Tier 1 Tribal Administration actually informs us, hordes are actually just a fancy form of tribes, from how EU4 deals with it in the game code. And what this means for us is that whenever we release a subject into the wild, we will release them as a tribe. So step 1 of this process is relatively simple. We need to go ahead and, well, actually annex Georgia. Once you've done that, you need to locate a province that has a Georgian core. You don't need to core this. Of course, I've cored this province because I've used the console to grab the province. However, what we basically need to do is return a province to create a one province Georgia. It's also possible to immediately release them as a subject, but I find that returning them is a nice way of making sure that we just have an OPM to work with. Georgia being an OPM is very important, because if they're not an OPM, they are significantly less likely to roll the anarchist state reform. In this case, because we're looking at 1444 borders, not a single Georgian core overlaps the Coptic area. However, if you're setting this up yourself, it is possible to get Coptic rebels to walk up over to here and start converting it, or have Georgia expand and gain some cores within the Coptic land. I've seen both cases happen, and while it's not a prerequisite, a Coptic Georgia is slightly better in our case, since the Coptic religion comes with plus 15% fort defense right off the bat. Anyway, any religion Georgia just works, and the province I'm going to suggest that you return to them is actually going to be this drylands here. The reason I suggest this dryland is that it doesn't really have a lot of things going for it. It is not a centre of trade or anything. It is a wine province, so it's not actually that amazing. And basically, you're not going to weaken yourself, or you're going to weaken yourself the least amount by losing control of this province. Anyway, once you've returned a province to Georgia, making sure you create Georgia in the process, you will see that you would have popped out a Georgia tribal kingdom. They've actually rolled a really good ruler for this. At this point, we need to get lucky. And if you're doing a no-bird run, so you're not doing auto falls if you get unlucky, you're going to have to re-annex them once they pop out, which is going to be annoying with truces, or you hope they ally someone in the area that you can use to move in and re-annex them. Or if you're doing a auto fall run where you bird away bad RNG, just make a save here and wait on the month tick when they will select their first reform. So in this case, they've selected tribal monarchy, which is not what we're looking for, so we either need to bird or re-annex them. To be clear, in practice, we have around a 33% chance each time to actually have them obtain the correct reform. Anyway, welcome back, this time under a bit of a different administration. Ah, perfect. And indeed, this time Georgia decides to become a kingdom stateless society, and this is what we're looking for. Now you need to go ahead and vassalize Georgia. Won't be able to do it diplomatically because you probably own their cause, so go ahead and integrate them a bit more directly into your administration. Once you've done that, so you grab them as a vassal, you can go ahead and designate them as a march. Naturally, at this point, they're probably not going to have that much development, so this should be less than 25%, so they'll be able to obtain the bonuses. And at this point, this becomes really stupid, as Georgia has 25% fort defensiveness in their opening tradition, they have 75% defensiveness from their fort defensive ideas, and of course they're a march, giving them an extra 20% defensiveness. But this somehow gets even better and even stupider. As I alluded to earlier, certain nations within EU4 are coded to have preferences for idea groups they go down. Portugal, for example, is notoriously going to be going down exploration expansion. Byzantium loves taking religious ideas, as does Syria for whatever reason. I'm not sure about that one. I'm sure some Syrian historians would love to enlighten me. But nevertheless, Georgia is coded to love, you guessed it, defensive ideas. So I've given Georgia 2 levels of technology, aka I'll let them unlock their first slot. And they've selected diplomatic ideas just to ruin this video, god damn it. Yeah, okay, a preference isn't a locked-in-stone thing. They will just also sometimes take ideas dependent on the personalities of their ruler. Surely though, once we give them Tech 7 and they have access to one more idea group, they will actually select the correct idea if I need for the demonstration. Right? Ah, nice, they did actually select defensive, thank god. So they're pretty heavily weighted to select defensive. It's not a guarantee, but usually you're going to see defensive between the first 1 to 3 idea groups. Sometimes you see it taken fourth, but that is really rare, and at that point I do apologize, you're just unlucky. And the reason, of course, that taking defensive ideas is really nice is because defensive ideas have another 25% fort defensiveness inside of them. From naturally, the idea defensive mentality. If you also manage to pull off a Coptic Georgia, again, it's possible, but definitely not required, Well, you'll have a 160% fort defensiveness Georgia, which is absolutely disgusting. Now, to be clear, some of you may be thinking, why not release them in this province and feed them the monument here? Wouldn't that give them extra defensiveness? Well, it would, but only within the region, which is not that helpful in the grand scheme of things. It's also just a nice monument to have if you want to defend the region in question, but yeah, this does nothing outside of the Georgia region. Nevertheless, 145% or 160% defensiveness is already absolutely disgusting. Indeed, if we go back to our previous example of charters here, and grant this occupation to Georgia, it's going to have 160% defensiveness as previously mentioned, but what's even more amazing is of course Georgia's fort maintenance is going to be reducing that to just 0.7 ducats a month instead of 1, so even save a little bit of money on the fort maintenance. Now let's see how painful it is to siege back. France, of course, has a little bit of siege ability. They have the 15% from their leader, and they have 5.6 from just being France. Nevertheless, with 139% defensiveness, France is going to be spending 77 days as siege tick, which is absolutely miserable. Actually, this is a bit of a lie, since I did give Georgia Tech 7, they have a bit of a tactics difference, so there we go, I'm now giving France Tech 7. Which means, sorry, not 77 days, 71 days, as you shouldn't be having such ridiculous tactics differences. Nevertheless, this is still, as you can guess, really, really strong. And most crucially, saves you a lot of money on fort maintenance if you're going to be microing this, as hordes tend to be very burn everything to the ground, meaning that when they capture forts, they tend to, if anything, delete them if they're not struggling with rebel issues, so that depends on playstyle, but nevertheless, normally when you occupy a fort, you kinda have to pay for it, unless, of course, you transfer it to your trusty Georgia friends. More of a mandatory friendship, but you get the point. If you're playing as a horde, you should strongly consider grabbing yourself a Georgia vassal, because you disproportionately benefit from the reduced fort maintenance from occupations that this incurs, as well as the military utility of any forts that you occupy having ridiculous bonuses to their defensiveness. If you aren't doing this, however, trying to wrap up your world conquest, or at least be in a position where you don't really rely on this defensiveness, by around the 1650s, 1700s. What I find by that period is that any subject that you release, in this case Georgia, or anyone that you release as a anarchist society, well, that's around the time they finish their reforms. Which I've just realized means that hopefully the Georgian AI also grabs this reform here for extra fort defensiveness, extra garrison size, extra max hostile attrition, extra tush for enemies, and even more fort maintenance, but nevertheless, apart from being absolutely amazing for specifically this role as a stateless society, vassal holding vassal, unfortunately, eventually the AI will go ahead and reform into a republic, and when it does, they're going to become a peasant republic. A very cool government reform for sure, but unfortunately they're not going to retain their amazing fort-holding abilities. And that 75% defensiveness from being an anarchist state is very hard to pass up on. So it's just something again to bear in mind. But with that said, that is unfortunately all the time I have for you today. Thank you very much for watching. A special thank you to all my channel members, especially Ark, Soda, W Haste, Lemon, Star72, Lord Zendikar, Nick Fassbender, Nanhatan, Nick Huss, The Awesome Rabbit, Best Row Gaming, Gramble Flavia, Sov, Mobkiller, Anthony35, AC Napo, Glorious Leader, Frankie, Yukata, Danray, Private Claw, Jack, Malvi, Conspiracy Pizza, and Lebarule.